I know people are gonna say, "Oh, nobody's perfect. He's a human being."
Let's see. You guys tomorrow watching today.
Last year, Elden Ring was a defining moment for the video game industry. It was my personal game of the year, and it was also game of the year of almost all of the award ceremonies and shows. At the end of the year with Jeff Keighley's video game award show, it also got those honors. Elden Ring was special. And when those reviews hit when the game released, when all of the critics came with the same consensus that this was a special game and that universal praise was seen by pretty much everybody, you don't see that very often. There's only a couple of games every couple of years that get that sort of praise. I can think of a couple off the top of my head: Breath of the Wild, Grand Theft Auto 5 when it released in 2013, Red Dead 2, Super Mario Odyssey. There's a couple of games, and that's why Elden Ring kind of took a lot of us by surprise. You know, Rockstar Games has that history. Nintendo, obviously. But From Software, they've had that praise, but Elden Ring was a little different, and there's a reason why that game went on to sell like 20 million copies in a year. But there's been a lot of people wanting those type of experiences, and we don't see them very often. The last time we had a game come kinda out of left field and get that same attention and praise from the masses was like CD Projekt Red with The Witcher 3 back in 2015. Just doesn't happen often. Now, what was weird with Elden Ring, though, was the fact that we actually saw certain game developers go on social media and openly bash From Software for how they went about their game design. It was actually some that had worked on Horizon Forbidden West and those of Assassin's Creed. They went on social media very upset about the minimalistic UI and quest design and not understanding why gamers and games media fell in love in future games and also inspire them, and that is good for the health of the industry. Now, the weird thing is, though, again, we're seeing similar arguments happening with Baldur's Gate 3, which is set to launch in the coming days. It's been in early access the last couple of years, and this game looks to be absolutely massive. A role-playing game with turn-based combat. If you have not heard, it has 174 hours of cinematics, twice the length of Game of Thrones, and I think in total it has like over 2 million lines of dialogue. It's just crazy, or 2 million words in its script. I think compared to like Mass Effect Trilogy, all three of those games, it's like double. So this is just it's a huge experience, something that is, it's like the dream of anybody who loves RPGs. And that's why so many people are excited about this game, but online we've seen a lot of game developers I would say they're kind of upset and criticizing Baldur's Gate 3 and Larian Games for what they've put together and kind of calling it nonsensical, the scale and scope that they've put together, which is, again, it's just weird seeing this game developers coming out even before launch to say that they do not want this to set a new standard. And the problem is that that's what we've seen that's defined this industry. Mass Effect back in 2007 defined cinematic RPGs. Elden Ring recently. Breath of the Wild a couple of years ago. If you want to go further back, GTA 3 was what started off really the open world genre in gaming. These games, these anomalies, they always set a new standard. It inspires this industry, pushes things forward, because the status quo needs to be broken. We can't keep having Assassin's Creed 75 because it gets fucking repetitive and boring. And that's why so many people, including myself, are just frustrated with the design of those games. And there is a disconnect between the developers of those games and what myself and maybe you even want. But Baldur's Gate 3 has been quite the journey the last number of years. This obviously started off with BioWare developing these games, then there was some expansions and some remasters within the last number of years, but I know that Obsidian, I think Black Isle Studios, and Exile Entertainment all voiced at some point that they wanted to make this third game, but for reasons it didn't happen. And with Larian, they really had to prove themselves to even get permission from Wizards of the Coast, who own the Dungeons and Dragons IP, to make this title, and they proved themselves with Divinity Original Sin 2. And they've been working on this obviously since 2017, then early access came in 2020, with I believe it having the first act around 25 hours worth of content, and they've been working on this for the last number of years, and they finally reached the point where it's soon to release. And yes, there's a lot of opinions about it, but Baldur's Gate 3, it has just an expansive, insane character creation, just so many different options. You don't see this in any RPGs, honestly, especially at this scale. Obviously there's subclasses, there's classes, there's sub-races, there's races, there's 600 spells, there's companions, there's that classic dice rolling for ability checks, 17,000 different ending variations. Lead writer spent about 6 months just working on the endings, and I'm sure most of them are probably very, very small in terms of their differences, but Still, the amount of work that Larian has put into this game is remarkable, to say at the very least. There are romances, and I'm sure you've heard about one of them because it's the reason why the Steam sales have gone through the roof, and that is that you can screw a bear. Yes, you heard that right. Larian really not holding it back in terms of romance, sexuality, and I applaud them for that because other developers, seems like just having a side boob seems to be something that's controversial. Don't know why that is, but regardless, Baldur's Gate 3, if it's not clear, this is a massive experience on all fronts. And now this leads us to this article coming from Game World Observer, why devs consider Baldur's Gate 3 anomaly, not new standard for RPG genre, it's Rockstar level nonsense for scope. And it all really originates from this tweet, which came from an indie developer who's worked on Space Warlord Oregon Trading Simulator, and he also mentions that he's working on Stranger Things VR. Xavier Nelson Jr. I apologize if I said that wrong, but he first outlines what separates Larian and their work on Baldur's Gate 3 versus other developers. He says that the long development cycle that started back in 2017, although I think that's kind of like just the standard development cycle nowadays, they have two previous games that are similar in some regards, Divinity Original Sin and Original Sin 2, worth of tech and institutional knowledge to draw from. They had a successful early access period lasting 3 years that provided Larian with community feedback, bug hunting, and cash flow, which, might I just add, maybe that's a good thing for the industry, something that's different, and it seemed to work successfully for Larian. They had a huge team of over 400 developers across 7 offices, and the license for one of the largest entertainment IPs. And then he says, this is the start of his tweet thread, like a lot of people, I'm deeply excited about what the lovely folks at Larian accomplished with Baldur's Gate 3, but I want to gently, preemptively push back against players taking that excitement and using it to apply criticism or erase standard RPGs going forward. This is not a new baseline for RPGs. This is an anomaly. He furthermore added that trying to reach the same bar without the same experience and advantages could kill an entire group of studios, and that's fair to some degree, maybe to the indie and AA developers, which probably Larian could be considered that, but I just don't think that's at all. I think it's kind of an excuse for the AAA games industry. Now, Nelson Jr. called for celebrating Larian and everything the team managed to achieve, but he noted that people who think other devs now have no excuse if their RPG doesn't look or feel like Baldur's Gate 3 are just creating the expectations and conditions to ensure your favorite creators may never be able to give you the thing you love ever again. Now, the most surprising thing about this thread is the fact that there were so many AAA game developers agreeing with it, some quote tweeting it, some just liking and retweeting it. We had developers from EA, BioWare, Criterion Games, many from CD Projekt Red, Ubisoft, Hangar 13, Riot Games, Rockstar Games, Epic Games, Guerrilla Games, Focus Entertainment, Eidos Montreal, Bungie, Bethesda, and so on and so forth, Xbox, Sony. They were all in agreement with this thread, and I just find it kind of absolutely insane. However, one developer from one studio isn't the collective opinion, because we saw other game developers disagreeing, and we'll talk more about those opinions a little bit later on. But some of the notable takes that were in agreement, we had a developer from Grimlore Games, another smaller studio. The whole thread, you can't be appalled about how much big games cost to make and make those lavish productions the standard by which all games are judged. I hope Baldur's Gate 3 is a generous once-in-a-lifetime RPG. I hope no one expects a 10, 20, 40 person team to make one, and I agree with that. That is fair. It's just the studios with like 1,000 developers, I don't think there's an excuse for that. We had an Insomniac's games design manager urging others not to use a singular game to set expectations for everyone developing RPGs because it isn't useful and instead foolhardy. Okay. We had Obsidian Entertainment design director Josh Sawyer noted that having the foundation set and the funding to build things on your own terms is invaluable. This is not about downplaying talented people working on BG3, but about acknowledging the case is atypical from the games industry. Maybe it shouldn't be atypical in my opinion. We had Nick Tringali, a game designer at Lunar Division. He thinks players should always take into account labor hours and other resources spent on a game before judging it by a certain standard. Games do not need to increase in size or technological complexity forever. That is just a narrative created by technology companies. We had James Berg, senior technical program manager at Xbox, saying that the amount of dev time put into Baldur's Gate 3 could equal 2 to 3 other games in the RPG genre combined. It's Rockstar level nonsense for scope. Only a few studio groups could even try this. We had an editor of the CRPG book project, compared the situation around Baldur's Gate 3 to what BioWare did with Baldur's Gate 2. Equipped with the engine and the right team, the studio spent 2 years crunching and made one of the biggest RPGs ever. We actually had a Diablo 4 senior designer commenting on this. He agreed again with this thread, saying that it is important to remember that not all studios operate under the same conditions. He compared Baldur's Gate 3 to Ultima 7, the favorite RPG of Larian founder Sven Vink. That's a game that had 12 years of prior games feeding into it. Another Blizzard developer, one working on Overwatch 2, saying it's possible we are in an era of cathedral games, massively ambitious, ornate, and expensive projects that, like the great cathedrals, might seem like historical anomalies at some point in the future. So essentially, to summarize, we have a lot of AAA game developers applauding, even praising Larian, but taking it a step back, saying that great job, but that's not something that gamers can expect from us. It's not realistic, and what you did here is actually kind of absurd and insane, and that's just kind of crazy. Although this is definitely not the first time that we've had these opinions shared. We actually talked about this a couple of months ago. From CD Projekt Red and BioWare developers sat down for a roundtable with PC Gamer. They actually responded to a recent article. The cinematic BioWare style RPG is dead. It just doesn't know it yet. And apparently a bunch of lead designers at CDPR said that everyone actually, after reading this article, said we mostly agree actually with the thesis. At least when it comes to AAA, we're just running at a fucking wall, I think, and we're gonna crash on that wall really soon. Sasko's comments above kicked off a discussion on the technology behind today's big budgets games and the expectations players have for them. The wall Sasko referred to is the ballooning complexity and expense of making games like Cyberpunk 2077. And former Dragon Age creative director Mike Laidlaw said the primary challenge to him is controlling player expectations with these RPGs. As soon as you're delivering something that starts to be cinematic, you then are essentially inviting comparison to the most cinematic things, so you're kind of keeping pace with Naughty Dog or Cyberpunk. So certainly this opinion about big budget games, not necessarily just RPGs, but big budget games in general, has been around. It just hasn't really been discussed too much, but here we are with Larian, this current situation with Baldur's Gate 3, we're once again having that conversation. And indeed, while many have shared and supported that original perspective from that tweet we talked about earlier, we did see some game developers pushing back on that. We had a former Riot Games developer saying, I can't disagree with this one more. Whenever a game disrupts the industry and delights players beyond expectations, it absolutely raises the industry and genre standards regardless of the why and how. I am not saying games should all be judged the same way across different production budgets and experiences, but I believe most players understand the context to not compare apples to oranges, for sure. What's worrying and upsetting to me is seeing colleagues in AAA studios jump at the opportunity to agree with this sentiment. We should look at the Larian success story and ask ourselves, how are we going to make our games better and create the next games that shake up the industry? Players should and must always expect more from us.